The CCA has worked actively with different kinds of collections to develop curatorship as a creative site of knowledge production. Archival and curatorial practice are core research activities of our work, both to conserve collections and for making them accessible to artists, scholars, and students. Projects, publications, and courses run through the CCA aim to open up novel combinations of the historically separated domains of the creative arts and the truth-claiming discourses of history and the social and natural sciences. The Spiral series draws on the CCA's long-standing interest in the nature of archive and its intersections with the curatorial as a programmed set of conversations about conceptions, configurations, and representations of art, the curatorial, and the archival. The title Spirals is as peculiar as it is purposeful. Peculiar because it is a metaphor of fierce, perhaps even destructive circulation. Purposeful in that it is the possibilities of disorder, but also renewal presented by such a metaphor that we find especially productive. The spiral, therefore, provides the possibility for conceptually sweeping across the linearities that structure our basic assumptions about archive, art, the academy, and the curatorial. As a space of circulation, these conversations are a site of sharing perspectives on crucial yet common questions about the nature of archive and the practice and work of the curatorial. We convene in virtual space online between Berlin and Cape Town. This has been made possible in part due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that has upended our personal lives, our relationships, our professional worlds. We've been challenged to sit with and work through the discomforting question of what scholarly work means in these extraordinary times. Today's talk is therefore timely in a complicated set of ways. It is important to stress that we want to abandon with the assumption about our speakers coming in and conveying lessons, so to say, as if the scholarly, artistic, and curatorial work being done in Berlin is at the vanguard that those in the global south should passively absorb. Certainly, Berlin is a major global hub of artistic and scholarly work, but in many ways, so is Cape Town, South Africa, and the African continent more generally. These conversations are meant to enrich our perspectives here at the University of Cape Town, but also to challenge our speakers to contribute to them thinking differently. We therefore meet as a community of learning with different views brought to bear on a shared set of questions about the nature of archive, artistic practice, and the curatorial, and the assumed stakes and investments that attach to these. This session is titled Black Feminism, the Scholarly and the Curatorial. We are very excited and glad to host the Berlin-based historian of science, Dr. Edna Bonhomme, as our guest speaker. Dr. Bonhomme earned a PhD in the history of science from Princeton University and a Master of Public Health from Columbia University. Working with sound, text, and archives, she explores contagion, epidemics, and toxicity through decolonial practices and African diaspora world-making. Using textual archives and oral histories, she unpacks variant notions of sickness and health, as well as the modalities of care that shape the possibility for repair. Artistic language combines science studies with traditional healing elements. Her project, Black Health in Germany, is part of a long-term research project that was started in 2019 with a growing collection or archive on the representation of Black health and healing in Germany. Her critical multimedia projects have been featured at Haus der Kultur in der Welt, Alpha Nova Gallery Futura, both in Berlin, and the Austrian Academy of Women Artists. She's a prolific author. She is the host of the exciting podcast, Decolonization in Action. And just to note, some of the academic and popular sites where she's published, these include places like Al Jazeera, the Baffler, the Guardian, the Nation, the New Republic, Africa as a Country, and Africa as a Country, as well as publishing in journals like the Journal for North African Studies and ISIS, the History of Science Journal, among many others. Her talk is titled Imperial Fevers, Invisible Lives. As she puts it, epidemics aren't just about the bacteria and viruses that coexist with us, but they reflect the social divisions that push some people to the margins of society. whether it is the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Black American communities or the high incidence of maternal mortality for Black people. We have to reckon with our histories and legacies of inequality create the phenomenon of premature death. This talk examines these inequalities as it relates to sexual and reproductive health of Black women in the United States and beyond. Edna, we're honored to have you here with us and excited to be talking with you about your work.
Thank you so much for having me and including me on this program. Is it possible for me to share my screen?
Just give me one more minute and then I'll empower you to be able to share your screen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to introduce Namusa and set out a set of themes and then allow you to share your screen.
Perfect.
In this conversation, we engage with the Black feminist intellectual enterprise and its intersections with notions of death, healing, and health, healing, and the curatorial. We're keen and curious to hear about Dr. Bonham's work on health and healing expands and shifts in thinking in and with the curatorial. Our point of departure is a question that sits centrally in her practice, that is, what makes people sick and Black folk especially sick? Where do science and art meet in interrogating notions of health? And what possibilities for healing can we find in the curatorial? We are delighted to have Associate Professor Namusa Makuba in the Michaelis School of Fine Art as our discussant. Professor Makubu works broadly in art interventionism, popular culture, live art, and social engagement in African visual art. She was the recipient of the ABSA Le Atelier Gerard Sekoto Award in 2006 and the Prix du Studio National Arts Contemporary, apologies, my French is not that good, Le Fresnoy in 2014. She received the American Council of Learned Societies African Humanities Program Fellowship Award and was selected to be an African Studies Association Presidential Fellow in 2016. In 2017, she was also a UCT Harvard Mandela Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, Harvard University. She is the founder of the Creative Knowledge Resources Project. She co-edited a third text special issue, The Art of Change, in 2013, and later co-curated with Nkule Mabaso, the international exhibition Fantastic. And in 2015, The Stronger We Become, that was in 2015, and The Stronger We Become in 2019 at the 58th Venice Biennale in Italy. Many, many thanks for coming on board as our discussant today, Namusa. So Zoom fatigue is weighing on all of us, so we'd like to keep the tone casual, easy, and accessible. Our session is therefore somewhat shortened. Edna will shortly present a talk and accompanying media. Namusa will then have some time for questions and exchange, and after which we'll open up for a round of questions. Please keep cameras turned off during the presentation. Please raise hands for questions or post them in the chat box for us to gather. And it would be great if you identified yourself when your question is called up. Thank you so much. So let me see if I can empower Edna.
I have the power to do it now. Yeah. Share.
Welcome to Cape Town, Edna.
We're
happy to have you in our presence today.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for this wonderful invitation. I'm quite honored to be in conversation and dialogue with all of you, and to also raise a host of questions about a work in progress that I currently have. My book, or the book that I'm currently working on, which focuses on epidemics and captivity. And last year, everyone obviously regained an interest in biology, including thinking about mRNA, genomes, and viruses. And at the wake of this current global pandemic, the presence of the novel coronavirus, popularly known as COVID-19, has forced us to think about our relationships to disease, mutations, etc. And so part of what I've been trying to do in my research is to think more deeply, not just about how the inequalities around disease inequities exist today, but also how they play out in various social justice contexts. I'm informed, or at least my work is informed, in terms of thinking about how COVID is very much a part of an ongoing mirror and magnifying glass towards the defective aspects of society here in Europe, where I'm currently based, but also in the United States, where I was born and raised. So in thinking about what that means, I tried to look to Black feminist writers and thinkers, people like Ruha Benjamin, who is an African-American scholar and theorist and sociologist, who specifically has written a host of work looking at the nexus of science and technology studies, specifically thinking about everything from partial imagination, urging us to have sustained commitment to incorporating critical race approaches when studying the sciences and medicine more broadly. This particular quote is from Catching Our Breath, which preceded the events of 2020. And she writes, the political refrain, "I can't breathe," is a clarion call of renewed movement for justice. I argue that writing, public health practices, etc., is predicated on thinking about these renewed movements for justice, but it's also thinking about how necropolitics have played out previously. So the current work in progress that I'm looking at is a book that I'm working on called Captive Contagions. The book traces the history of contagion.
Edna, your sound seems to have been switched off.
Sorry about that. My work is informed by Alice Walker, who most recently wrote in Barracoon for Zora Neale Hurston's reprint of her book. Barracoon said, quote, "Life inexhaustible goes on the author." And we do carry our wounds and our medicines as we go. Ours is amazing, a spectacular, a journey in the Americas. It is remarkable, one can be thankful for it, bizarre as it may sound. Perhaps our planet is for leaning to appreciate the extraordinary wonder of life that surrounds even our suffering, and to say yes through the thickest of tears. And so the purpose of this book is to think about these racialized histories, the several epidemics that have emerged from the late 19th century and onwards. And the purpose of thinking about captivity, specifically how captivity emerges from the Latin word captivus, which thinks about containment, but also how that has played out today. So for me, confinement has had a direct impact, specifically as an African diasporic person whose family migrated from the Caribbean to Miami, and what that looks like with respect to the HIV/AIDS crisis during the 1980s. So in 1981, my father took a boat from the coastal town of La Baie in northern Haiti, leaving his family behind. After several centuries of intensive agricultural production that degraded the soil, decades-long droughts, and a series of hurricanes, my father and his relatives could no longer live off the land. At the time, he was 19 years old with a high school education and an opponent of the then dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier. Not only did my father leave Haiti to escape the repressive regime, but he also wanted to absolve himself of the abject poverty that had marked his life thus far. The coastal village, which, if you can see the map, it sits on the northern portion of Haiti, and it is also resting on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, but also proximity to the rest of the Caribbean Sea. With no paved roads or running water or electricity, the only jobs that were available at the time were fishing and farming. He, along with thousands of other Haitians, became known as the boat people during that period of the 1980s and early 90s. And they voyaged from Haiti to the United States, traveling on overcrowded vessels, briefly passing through Cuba before embarking on the lower portion of the Florida Keys. Without training or skills and only speaking Haitian Creole and French, his options were limited, and he decided, like other working class Haitians, to settle in Lemon City, a Miami neighborhood, doing manual tasks as day laborers and eventually becoming a salaried sanitation worker. 2 years later, my mother also joined from Haiti, also living in this neighborhood. On the one hand, the neighborhood was lively, often having major demonstrations, Veo, which was a local and still is a local Haitian language radio station based in the neighborhood. And people were very much forging a new identity in their adopted homeland. And in some ways, this enclave echoed the traffic of Port-au-Prince, the smell of the conch salad in Gonaïve. And to my parents' dismay, though, the 1980s was also a period in which the Haitian community was blamed for spreading HIV/AIDS. When HIV/AIDS emerged in the United States in 1981, the wave of Haitian immigrants was erroneously deemed as responsible for that particular pandemic. So on the 4th of March, 1983, the United States Center for Disease Control listed 4 supposed groups as high risk for contracting HIV/AIDS. Haitians were among one of them. The other groups were intravenous drug users, including and homosexuals and hemophiliacs. Humans and microbes have lived in communion with each other, whether that relationship is antagonistic or beneficial. However, that relationship can change if the microorganism is associated with people's anxiety about sex, people's ideas about racialized groups, and even if the virulence that causes the disease is sharp and with swift death. So the life cycle of a disease is not just a matter of the number of microbes that live with us, but the political order of things, the medical advancement, the medical apartheid that comes with understanding the science of contagion and the environments we occupy. Our engagement with epidemics in the modern context is an extension of the regimes that we live in, the broad borders we cross, and our possibilities of care. And so in thinking about that intimate relationship between recent family history, as well as what it meant to grow up in a neighborhood that was segregated and perceived as a petri dish of disease, it also provided me with the ways in which our history, specifically Haitian history, was tied to not just captivity, but US imperialism, to the invisibility of this community also having other forms of care that was possible outside of the realms of this particular public health crisis. Some people seem intent on forgetting those lessons of history, and some even go further to be haunted by the events that hurt them, those memories often lingering, creating a sound creating a condition by which we have to develop and address certain new pandemics. These epidemics, of course, do not flourish in isolation, and as such can be understood within the context of shifting ideas of how we understand and produce or deter contagions. What would it mean to think about epidemics not merely as a microbial invasion, but one in which we can assert life and death and how society responds to epidemics? I argue in the book and even beyond that the key to understanding the outcomes of these epidemics is to explore captivity that is man-made and not just quote unquote natural, and to really think about what Ed Cohen has regarded as, quote, the politics of viral containment, relentless plays upon the contingency of the human, we. It conceptually and materially confounds our understanding both of how individuals constitute our collectives and how we exclude other collectives. Growing up in the segregated community of Little Haiti in Miami, a neighborhood whose history is tied to migration and xenophobia, I also discovered how that cordon community and space was also rife with the public health history of the United States more broadly. In the beginning of the stage of the outbreaks, this disease was poorly understood, very much how coronavirus was poorly understood at the beginning. Haitians were blamed for HIV/AIDS, and we have seen, at least in the US context and in other contexts as well, people of East Asian descent also being erroneously blamed for the disease. In the case of HIV/AIDS and the Haitian community, it led to housing discrimination and other forms of disenfranchisement. And the disease, as horrific as it was not the only affliction facing Haitian migrants in the United States, who were burdened by the weight of social alienation, linguistic barriers, the class politics that also existed. So epidemics aren't just about that bacteria and viruses that coexist with us, but they also speak to those who are invisible, those who are on the margins of society. And what we are finding again and again is that containment of epidemic often pathologizes non-white, non-Western, and people who are often perceived as a source of contagion. Putting aside the more obvious xenophobia of the recent US president who referred to COVID-19 as a virus that was deemed to be for a particular nationality, the outright downplaying the consequences of coronavirus is itself a racially coded act, given the disproportionate mortality rate for non-white people in countries like the UK and the US. Well, the late African-American writer Toni Morrison wrote, "We die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language, that may be the measure of our lives." In thinking about the history of Haiti, thinking about the history of HIV/AIDS, thinking about the current history that we're living in, I want to continue to write about a social history of illness and disorders that play out for marginalized people, for those who are confined without their consent, and for those who actively resist the social forces that cause disease to proliferate. This is not merely a medical history, but a cultural history that speaks to imperial medicine and the politics of disease more broadly. Unfortunately for the poor and disenfranchised, even in the global north countries, that experience of living through epidemics can show how microbial contagions mutate along open veins of society. And so I'm thinking about what does it mean for me as not just a writer to look at disease. It's also a question of thinking about curating medical history through care. And one of the ways in which I've done that or try to do that is by documenting various African diasporic experiences of medical health industries here in Berlin, but also across the Atlantic Ocean for people who are part of the Caribbean diaspora and African diaspora more broadly. And I want to share a little snippet of that sound kind of archive that I've also been working on through an exhibition that I had here in Germany last year called Cartographies of Care, alongside with my one of my collaborators, Nina Anuoha.
I'm 34, I was born in 1985. I identify as a Black woman. I am ethnically Jewish, and I practice Judaism. As a German Black woman, it's not easy to answer because it's not something that I've chosen. Racialization processes, I think, are put on to people. It so happens that I identify as Black and that I practice Judaism. I think I would be racially also classified as Black, and I'd be racially classified as somebody who is Jewish. So I would have been deported during that era because I'm Black and also because I'm Jewish. Kreuzberg of my childhood and Kreuzberg now are very different. It's like living in two different places, really.
I'm going to stop it there, but part of what the significance of this documentation and specifically this interview is that it's part of a broader corpus of materials in which, in order to see what Black history and Black presence in Germany is, it's important to note how we as Black people who live here are documenting our own stories, are recording that so that we can create an archive. There have been a host of Black scholars who are based here, Dr. Natasha Kelly, amongst one of many, who've been trying to the best of their ability to honor the history of Maya Ayim, who is an Afro-German poet, Audre Lorde, who is a Caribbean-American Black woman who lived here in Germany as well, and to really acknowledge that collecting our stories is about exercising a cartography of care. It's a politics of repair and a possibility for a more just future. And it also just relates to what Ingrid Lafleur, who's a curator and Afrofuturist, says, is that looking and thinking about the intersection of imagination and technology, in order for us to understand and imagine the future, it also requires creating our new archives. This also relates to what it means to write my history into my research, which is creating archives through methods that aren't always textually based. So as a person who is a descendant of slaves with whom there were no, to my knowledge, any documented information about my family until they arrived to the United States, unfortunately, That means that one of the ways in which I've been documenting our history is through herbal plants, through healing, and through stories. So another example of that documentation is through filmmaking. And so this particular thing that I would show you is me in conversation with my aunt in Haitian Creole, where we talk about plants that we've used for healing practices for multiple generations, and the way in which that allows us to maintain our archives. So I'll play that as well very briefly.
Qui va les affaires? Oui. Qui va les bon pour? Cancer? Ouais. Mais qui va y aller en créole? Simon Canton? Et ça? La chole? Oui. Oui. Nous la classifier aussi. Okay. Vous y êtes toujours? La chole? Oui. Qui va essayer?
Ça, son verre, 20 minutes. Mais t'as aussi un gavou dessous. Vous toujours, il mettait tête pour dedans.
I'll stop it there, but one of the things that that inspires this particular work and the archival practices, not just here in Germany, where I live, or even in the United States or in Haiti, where my family is currently living, is to think about more deeply what along the lines of what Toni Morrison refers to as home. Home is something very peculiar, something special, mystical, hopeful, and restful. And for me, making home and creating a home is about creating these archives. And for Black Americans, people like myself, many of whom have moved around and are constantly in a sense of, some people being in a sense of homelessness, others who actually see these various diasporic places as an opportunity for us to bear witness to a host of people, to learn new languages, to be able to applaud our resilience through creativity. And it also, in relating to the history of medicine, gives us the opportunity to hold multiple citizenships, multiple ways of healing, multiple passports into the world of healing, into the world of archival practices that predicate outside of the written text. And so in thinking about the historical relationship between what it means to be part of this African diaspora, and specifically in thinking about the question of captivity, segregation, and even in some cases being considered to be the vectors of disease, there's also another history, one that is tied to being able to exercise agency over one's body, being able to document one's history, and also being able to see how even when histories have tried to, as much as possible, predicate us to the margins, that we're still here. And I finally want to end with Audre Lorde's Cancer Journals, where she said, quote, "I need to remind myself of the joy, the lightness, and the laughter so vital to my living and my health. Otherwise, the other will always be waiting to eat me up with despair again. And that means destruction. I do not know how, but it does." And I think this is particularly relevant in a period in which activists and writers such as Adrienne Marie Brown, Saidiya Hartman, who's written extensively on critical fabulations and Black women's history, that it's not just a question of suffering and loss, but also one in which, at least from within the context of things like pleasure activism, we can be able to excavate different kinds of futures, different histories, one that is based on and through the agencies that we have, as opposed to the horrific and very violent tragedies of the past. And by way of kind of sharing some of those resources, I wanted to very much highlight some of these texts all written by Black women that point to questions around contagion, emergent diseases. How do we think about histories for people who may not have text, who may themselves not have written those texts? And then how do we create new archives generated from within our communities as those of us who are quite mobile, and what power that has in creating a new set of histories today. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your patience and also your attention.
Thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful and richly textured presentation, Edna. Much to think with. I'll now hand over the stage to Nomusa, who will give some questions and some feedback.
Thank you so much, Edna. I mean, I think it was a real privilege to have you present the work that you currently are busy with. And I mean, I'm sure most of us will agree that we look forward to the book once it's done. So what I'm going to do is perhaps maybe present a set of maybe perhaps, if one can call them, provocations for everyone else who's participating to also discuss. So not necessarily questions directed to you, but points of discussions that emanate from your presentation. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about a conversation I recently had with a colleague of mine who was saying that at some point with the rise of neoliberalism or the neoliberal agenda, it was argued that it makes sense to dump e-waste in Africa, mainly because in any case, our lifespan is so low. So it really didn't matter. If people died at the age of 50, and if one contracted cancer, you know, likely around those ages, it didn't matter, right? So part of it, I think, alludes to the systems, systems of justification around diseasing and around, you know, around the diseasing, or I don't know which way to call it, but the diseasing of the Black body in general, you know. And I mean, I think as you were talking about your parents' experience as well in Haiti, there's part of it, I think, that has to do with the laws that are put in place, right? So there's a structural notion to systems of health. The other point I wanted to raise is around caregiving and the responsibilities around caregiving. So as much as we talk about the ethics of care, I think what we became more and more aware of in the past year, well, at least with COVID-19, is that for centuries and centuries, the labor of care, and of course, if we think about care as work, I mean, obviously, when we talk about care these days, we often talk about care as a way to escape the captivity, as a way for us to hold each other in spaces, right? We talk about the spaces of healing as ethics of care. So there's a particularly different way in which we talk about care. But I think on the flip side of it, the other side of the coin, is this notion of care and caregiving and the labor of caregiving that's particularly been placed on women, Black women particularly. And if one thinks about it, it's the care that's actually part of the work they are paid to do, right? So if you think about slavery, if you think about domestic workers in the case of South Africa, I suppose everywhere in the world where you have these differentiations in terms of class. So this notion of caring as work, I think also, you know, in some ways could provide for us an avenue to begin to think about how we then translate it into this radical feminist notion that allows us to escape captivity. And then, of course, it brings us to this not only just, of course, how our bodies are related in terms of labor. So, of course, there's first the question of the judicial systems that keeps sucking us down into the impossibility of being healthy in you know, in all sort of you know, soma, the psychological, bodily, and all of this. So there's that, and then of course there's the relationship with our bodies and labor and the impossibilities of care and being cared for, and then of course the work we put in caregiving. And then the other one is and I think you refer to it when you talk about the use of the herbs as well, you know. So I mean, there's a kind of importance in recognizing the severance with our relationship to the environment, right? So there's and so I guess that provocation is about thinking through the relationship between radical Black feminism and ecofeminism, where women, of course, have been the ones to work the land, but also at the same time, the ones who are sort of severed, you know. So if you think about Black people, particularly, if you think about histories of dispossession and displacement, that relationship is a relationship of severance. And yeah, so I think, yeah, that one is about this relationship between radical Black feminism and ecofeminism. Then I was very much interested in the way that you brought in Afrofuturism as well, you know, which, you know, today the excitement around Afrofuturism seems to be waning. And one wonders if it's waning because it seems to be, I wonder whether it's because it seems to be based on this retrofuturist notion of returning to something we can no longer return to, right? But again, I think it's also because of the technocorporeality. So the possibility of being somewhere else except in this body that can so easily be subjected to hurt, to disease, and so on, right? So I thought that was particularly important because the one thing I think that made Afrofuturism very exciting, I mean, in its African-American iterations and the way that it sort of entered the conversation on the back of, you know, Afropolitanism and then African futurisms and then Afrofuturism, and all the people who were sort of, you know, deciding that perhaps it doesn't really work in the context of Africa. But I think it was this possibility of actually having a body that is no longer sentient, right? we feel the pain. And I think most of the politics around decolonization were really centered on this sort of notion of affect, of feeling, of pain, of anger. And so with this pain, that ailment, you know, right? So what do we do with that pain? And again, so, you know, Afrofuturism and the idea of technocorporeality, it's like once you have technology, it's as if you have this alternative where you can just switch off the immense notion of feeling, of pain, of bodily pain. But again, I mean, it also sort of fell into these ideas of, you know, this practice of futurism, which again became sort of picked up, not necessarily Afrofuturism, but there were so many futurist scholars and speakers last year because of the pandemic, right? Because everyone thought, you know what, this pandemic is probably going to change. It's a crisis, kind of crisis, that's probably going to change that way that we think about social reproduction. And so they needed these people who could imagine a world that's different from this one, right? So I mean, I guess what I'm trying to allude to in that sense, and again, these are just provocations, really. They're not necessarily questions for answers. It's just for us to discuss, is again to think about coming back to our bodies, because I think the very notion of being colonized was not necessarily being removed from place. And again, the severance from environment, but also being removed from our bodies. And if one can, at this moment, I'm just, you know, relying on the Fanonian notion of sort of, you know, hating one's own body, being taught to hate your own body, you know, so being the whole inferiorization of the Black body. And so, of course, our radical movements are about accepting, loving, this notion of self-love as a decolonial aesthetic, loving our bodies, and that's the only way we can reach this aesthetics of care and so on. So it kind of like, it's a kind of displacement and alienation, not only from place, cartography. I liked, I really enjoyed the exhibition that you co-curated, this sort of cartographies of care, because it also brings us back to the geopolitics of it. But there's also this notion of being removed from our bodies. So when you refer to homelessness, it kind of as a kind of double play in terms of the alienation that's felt. And I think the kind of dis-ease that most of us can identify with. So I think there were a lot of, there are really a lot of really exciting points about the talk that you've done that brings together so much. So that when we're talking about our bodies, we're not only confined to their definition as a race, but we are able to trace and map ourselves in terms of the connections that we've held, and not only in terms of solidarity between ourselves, but the connections with our environments, connections with knowledges that emanate from our environments that have been severed. So I'm putting those questions, I'm putting those provocations out to everyone that's participating, but obviously Edna, if you'd like to respond in the first instance, that would be great. I'll monitor the chat to see if there are any questions that come up, but please do raise your hand if you have questions. I do realize that we have about 12 minutes. So maybe Edna, if you'd like to respond, and then I'll look out for hands.
Sure, I can try to be as quick. Thank you so much for those provocations. They're so insightful, and I took some notes, so hopefully I can incorporate them as well into the book. And I think that in terms of the question around the Black body, that is very much at the center of my work, and I, in some ways, am borrowing from like Dorothy Roberts, African-American scholar, who's looked at the legal status of Black women and Black women's bodies through the text Killing the Black Body, where she uncovers the relationship between reproduction and how Black women were used both as the laborers, free labor vis-a-vis slavery in the Americas, but also how they were producing the next generation of slaves, and how that assault happened vis-a-vis sexual assault, and then beyond that, and this is where my role as a historian of science matters, how the Black women's bodies have been used for scientific research, whether it's through the work of Marion Sims, who is considered the father of gynecology. His research is based off of the experimentation of Black enslaved women from the 19th century. And particularly Saadia Hartman, who I mentioned, has done excellent work in challenging some of that, that research and his legacy, because his statue stood at the New York Public Library, where I used to live, for ages. He was celebrated, and it took the activism of Black feminists, Black women in New York City, to be able to allow him for that statue to suddenly be challenged. And so when I think of the histories of Black bodies, whether it's Sabrina String's new book, Fearing the Fat Body, and how that's associated with gluttony and other forms of medicalized discrimination in North America, and also here in Europe, that there's an impossibility of the Black body being seen as healthy in these Euro-American spaces. Part of the work that I'm trying to do is to really, well, know the history of these very medically unethical practices that were done, whether it's the Tuskegee experiments, Robert Koch and his presence on the African continent and experimenting on Africans, the fact that there are skulls and body parts of Nama Herero people here in Germany. Like, knowing that history is the first step. And then once you know that history, what do you do with that? How do you empower yourself? And for me, the Afrofuturism question is a complicated one, because on the one hand, it suggests that we can only look to the future in order to have some kind of salvation, or at least some kind of peace of mind. And I actually think no, in the here and now, we need to create the conditions in order for us to be able to see and envision our liberation. In the here and now, we need to create the conditions so that those who are the most oppressed are being attended to, which is why I look to Black radical traditions such as the health clinic programs of the Black Panther Party that provided free health services to working class Black people within the communities in Oakland, Chicago, New York. The school programs that they provided free food to working class Black people in the 60s and 70s through the Black Panther Party, which then became a model for free lunch services throughout public schools in the United States, which I benefited from. If they didn't have those programs, as a working class person who was born and raised in the United States, again, because of the Black Panther Party, I would not have had certain forms of nutrient during my upbringing. And Alondra Nelson, who's an African-American sociologist, has written specifically on this topic, body and soul. So that history is so rich, the history of liberation in the here and now. Like for me, Afrofuturism has more to do with my my nerdiness. So I was a Black nerd and still am, I guess. And so it's like more of a personal thing than anything, as opposed to what's in fashion at the moment. And I'm so glad, and I think it's important for people to be angry at these systems of oppression. And Audre Lorde's The Uses of Anger speaks to that. I guess the question then becomes, how does that anger light your fire? How does it build community with the people who want to break bread with you and commune with you? And what can we do to creatively change and shift the narrative that has been imposed upon us? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. Well, Hupuleng's got a comment. Hupuleng, I wondered if you wanted to maybe speak to that.
Hi, thank you so much, Edna and Nomusa. I'll try and be quick, but I'm thinking a lot around slave narratives at the moment. And the one thing that keeps coming back is kind of this idea of gratitude and care. But at the same time, I really like what Nomusa has just kind of pointed out in terms of like the complexities of care as labor. So my comment was just to say that I'm really inspired by the notion of categories of care that are sounded out through unbounded relationality, but then also challenged by this complexity of care as a place or loophole of retreat, while also at the same time being real labor.
Yes, and I think that that observation is absolutely important and astute. And when we think about care work, specifically care work with respect to the medical industry, so people who are working in nursing homes, domestic workers, in the Euro-American context, that work is mostly being done by Black and Brown women. And in many cases, if we think about the rise of COVID cases and which essential workers who are doing the care work that exposes them disproportionately to the virus, and again, in the European and North American context, that has been mostly on the backs of Black and Brown women specifically. It is no accident, as in my family, most of the women are janitors, cleaners, in some cases, if they've had an education, nurses at best. And a good chunk of them have had COVID, contracted COVID. My mother contracted COVID, my sister, I've had a relative that died. It's become, all of those people were essential workers who were doing care work, and the class dimension of that and the labor aspect of that is quite difficult. So when we speak about care, we have to talk about the complications of the hierarchies of labor under capitalism and racial capitalism's role in putting certain people in a position whereby that labor of care is not adequately compensated, or even just how family structures if it is a family structure that is based off of a patriarchal nuclear heteronormative situation, that it in itself is quite dangerous to certain forms of liberation. We should ask ourselves in the way that Sophie Lewis, who has written about full surrogacy now, the extent to which we might want to challenge or destroy or abolish family structures as we know it, and to really engage with other kinship structures that allow for more communal or socialist mechanisms for labor exchange, for caring exchange, so that it's not relegated on the backs of Black and brown women, and that it's not something that disproportionately forces people, especially in this particular age, the impossibility of being healthy when people are disproportionately exposed to a respiratory disease. So yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. And of course, we have to think about the complications of care work when it's not adequately compensated, when it's gendered, when it's racialized, when it really destroys people's lives.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions, but I'm wondering if there are, I don't see any hands, but I'm wondering if there are any questions, especially I suppose in response to the provocations, because I think it would be quite nice to get some of the participants responding to them. Dwayne, I see your hand is up. We have about 3 minutes as well.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for the wonderful provocations, Nomusa, and it speaks so elegantly and also from an aside to the kinds of points that Edna was making. Thinking about setting up the session, Kay really sat with me because one of the genealogies that we trace at the Center for Curating the Archive for the idea of curation itself shows that the curator and curatorial practice is essentially about care. It's either about caring for objects or caring for people, and the responsibility that actually comes with that. And then I was also thinking about, this is just a set of relational comments, but like I was also thinking about how more frequently we sit with this phrase, take care. We use it so often in our personal exchanges. Please take care, take good care of yourself. And so how and in what ways care collapses these epistemologies of health and healing, as well as curatorial practice, objects and subjects into each other in very interesting ways. But it was really, really provocative the way in which you disentangled and deconstructed exactly the hierarchies of power that sit in that concept of care, and who the concept of care can work for at certain times. I think Bonaventure Ndikung, the curator in Berlin at Savi Contemporary, he's just released a new book with Archive Books, I think it's called, and the book is called The Delusions of Care. And in the book, he's unpacking exactly the way in which the notion of care has been co-opted for certain neoliberal and political ends. So it's really interesting to sit with this complicated notion of care and how it sits at these various intersections of Black feminism, of the scholarly, of capitalism, and health practice as well. It was really, really provocative. Edna, do you still have 5 minutes more? Do you think we can take maybe one more question from our students, or do you?
Sure, yeah, and I can actually respond to that question around the delusion of care, and I love Bonaventure's work, and have been very honored to be at Savvy for a couple of events and performances, and to be integrated into the programming. And I think one of the things that for me that I, on the one hand, I'm guilty of exercising self-care in the sense that the language, the actions, masking, like I like to do it in the way that allows for mindfulness and healing practices within my control. Yet I also recognize, if I'm going to be honest with myself, how that's a privilege, even if it's just the time to meditate for 10 minutes. When I think about the huge generational gap between my mother, who to my knowledge has never ever done anything that allows her to find that internal care or the time or the consciousness about that, versus me, who I do engage in those practices. I think the problem becomes when there is a kind of profit-driven motive towards and the lifestyle influencer method of saying, oh, this is the version of care that's allowed for people, and when it becomes commodified, and so maybe the delusion becomes if you pay for it and therefore you have it, and this is the only way to be a new kind of athletic leisure person in society. And I'm borrowing from Gia Tolentino's recent book, Trick Mirrors, which goes into how that there's an entire industry around the self-care motive and the extent to which it aligns itself with capitalism. So I really love this work, or the work on delusions of care. Just wanted
it's so provocative. It reminds me of an event that was held, I think it was immediately after a Black Lives Matter protest in Berlin one year at an event space called Akud Mach Neu. The event was titled Self-Care as Warfare. Self-care as warfare.
I think the real warfare, or the thing that I would want, is a redistribution of wealth and land that would actually allow for true like justice, but okay.
That's true. So Dwayne, perhaps maybe this might be at your, I'm not sure, because I see it's 4 o'clock. But maybe before I go, Edna, I just wanted to say thank you.
Can I ask a question quickly?
Sure.
Sorry.
Please.
Out of nowhere. Sure, why not?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was very empowering. I will say, as a Black woman, as a Black femme, I'm very grateful that work like this is being done. So I want to say thank you. My question is about, you said coming back to our bodies. I want to know what you would envision that being as a concept through like academia and curatorship. I know it's a very broad question, but I want to know what that can feel like and what that can look like as a person who is literally curating archives. If you have any thoughts on that, thank you.
I think that's such a great question, and in some ways it's a difficult question to answer, because depending on what space I'm in, looking the way that I do and having the body that I do, the skin, the hair, all of the things that I've learned to love, but society doesn't always, and the spaces that you're speaking of, academia and particularly art spaces, are sometimes the most hostile towards Black bodies than others. If I'm going to be unfortunately honest, like my academic training were at predominantly white institutions that didn't value Black scholarship. And so even working through those spaces as someone who wanted to do the work of documenting the histories of the oppressed, it also often came with great resistance. Or in some cases, when I wanted to make links, very important links between, the anti-colonial uprisings in North Africa to anti-colonial, anti-slavery narratives in the Caribbean, again, people at predominantly white institutions didn't want those class collaborations or international collaborations, even though that's very much part of our history. If we think about Frantz Fanon fighting with the Algerians and really defecting from the French imperial powers, that is what we do. We do the work of working together. And so I think for me, one of the things that I've been trying to navigate is not being tethered by the categories and the boxes that academic and university spaces have wanted, and to really be intentional about everything that I do is about collaboration and collaboration with people who are disenfranchised. When I was asked to do the exhibition at Alpha Nova Gallery on the cartographies of care, it was originally just me, and they're like, oh, we want you to do this. And I was like, nope, if I eat, everyone else eats. So I specifically decided I wanted to collaborate with someone who was born and raised in the continent and someone who is, queer. And it was just, that just became part of it. The last exhibition I did, Digital Prata, Dreaming Black Futures, again, I was the only one asked, but then I was like, nope, I need someone else to do this. And I invited someone else, a femme in to participate. And I think that part of the academic or curatorial work is if one is in, for me at least, if I am in predominantly white spaces, I cannot be the only one. I have to share those resources. I have to be in conversations with my community, and I have to be able to allow other people to fly if I'm going to quote unquote fly. And I think that we have to also in general pull away from the neoliberalization in the arts and the university systems by actually redistributing the resources and giving up a little bit. Because if we don't do that, then we reproduce the same individualism that is often rewarded in these spaces. So I would say that, yeah, it's a tough battle, but the key is collectivity. The key is working with others. The key is being in conversations and in commune. And the key is, you know, even if others don't appreciate what you have to offer now, just to keep going with that. 2020 was a turning point, and people are starting to lose interest, kind of like what Musa said, in some of these themes, but it doesn't mean that the work stops. It doesn't mean that we stop. And I really hope that y'all can continue to be inspired by all of the lovely scholarship and that is being produced right now. And hopefully through these coalitions and conversations, they can continue.
Thank you.
Edna, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for sharing some of your knowledge, and thank you for giving us a little bit of a preview for your new book.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, it's a process. If you ever write a book, make sure you have a good support system. That's all I can say. Dwayne has already been there, but.
I noticed that you have a chapter dealing with sexual apartheid, and that's probably to do with HIV/AIDS in some way.
No, actually, that one is dealing with that's based in Panama, so it's looking at U.S. imperialism in Panama and what we used to be called venereal diseases, but mostly focusing on syphilis. The chapter on HIV/AIDS is a little later, but yeah.
I know that you have a community here in South Africa that you can call upon if ever you need some comments or some feedback on some of the things that you're writing, and it was absolutely brilliant to have you. Thank you so much, Edna. We will be in touch with you. Just do not leave this space just yet. Thank you to all our visitors and guests and students attending our spiral session this afternoon. We have another spiral session coming up towards the end of April. So the sessions continue through the year. We're also very, very thankful to Nomusa for being here with us this afternoon. I mean, our semester has just kicked off this week, and it's been a crazy time. In some ways, 2020 did not end. We are still in 2020. We're still kind of putting 2020 behind us little by little. And for every little bit of energy and for every little bit of comradeship, we are truly, truly thankful. So thank you all, and see you at the next spiral session. I think it's on the 23rd of April. Ciao.
Thank you. Thanks so much.